The cargo bay doors slid open with a hiss, and Horvath ducked his massive frame through the entrance. His four eyes scanned the darkness, searching for movement. Somewhere in the shadows, three small creatures were hiding, and they had already sent two of his security officers to the medical wing with deep cuts across their arms and faces. "Come on out," Horvath called, his deep voice echoing off the metal walls. "We just want to help you." A snarl answered him, then another, then a third, higher pitched than the others. The Brellan security chief tightened his grip on the stun weapon and took another step forward. His thermal scanner showed three heat signatures huddled behind a stack of supply crates in the far corner point 3 days ago, as SWILT's transport had docked at Station Gamma 7 for emergency repairs. The pilot had seemed nervous, rushed. She claimed engine trouble, but the mechanics found nothing wrong. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, the SWILT woman had already departed, leaving behind 3 cubs in the cargo hold she'd rented. The cubs were small, barely reaching Horvath's knee if they stood upright. Their scales shimmered with colors that shifted between green and blue, and their eyes were too large for their faces. They should have been cute. Instead, they were terrifying. Every attempt to approach them ended in blood. The Quilix had tried sonic dampeners to calm them down. The cubs attacked the speakers. The Norvan empaths attempted to project peaceful thoughts. One empath was still unconscious from the psychic backlash of pure fear and rage. Chemical sedatives were considered too dangerous after the first attempt resulted in violent convulsions. Horvath watched the cubs through his scanner. They weren't eating. They weren't drinking. For 3 days, they had refused every type of food offered. Medical scans suggested they were dehydrated and weak, but that only made them more unpredictable. Cornered animals fought hardest when dying. "We need a decision," Horvath said into his communication device. "Commander Yeltris, these cubs won't survive another day without intervention." The Quilix commander's voice crackled through the speaker. "The council meets in 6 hours. We'll decide then. 6 hours might be too late. Then sedate them and force-feed them. We tried sedatives. You read the medical report." There was a long pause. "Then we wait for the council." Horvath closed the connection and stepped back toward the exit. As he moved, one of the cubs darted from behind the crates, claws extended. The security chief raised his weapon, but the cub stopped just out of reach, scales flashing bright red. It was the smallest one, the high-pitched snarler. The cub's mouth opened, showing rows of tiny sharp teeth, and it screamed at him. Not a roar, not a hiss, a scream of pure terror. Horvath lowered his weapon slowly. He'd been in security for 20 years across 4 different stations. He'd dealt with smugglers, pirates, and genuine threats. These cubs weren't threats. They were scared out of their minds. But of what? He backed out of the cargo bay and sealed the door. The council would meet. They would argue. Some would suggest freezing the cubs in stasis until SWILT authorities could retrieve them. Others would call for immediate termination, citing potential disease. A few bleeding hearts would advocate for more time, more patience, more resources poured into 3 abandoned creatures who seemed determined to die fighting. Horvath walked down the corridor toward the security office, his heavy footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Station Gamma 7 operated on a 26-hour cycle, and it was currently deep night. Most of the crew were asleep in the cafeteria. A single human sat at a corner table, eating what looked like noodle from a disposable container. Horvath recognized her vaguely. She'd arrived 2 weeks ago, some kind of specialist. Plant research, maybe. The station had 6 humans total, which was unusual for an Outer Rim facility. The human looked up as Horvath passed. She had brown skin and dark hair pulled back in a simple tie. Her name badge read, Dr. Helen Wright. "You look stressed," she said. Horvath paused. "Security matter. The cubs in Cargo Bay 3. You heard about that?" Helen nodded. "Hard not to. Everyone's talking about the feral SWILT babies. Is it true they attacked 5 people?" "2. Horvath corrected. "The stories grow with each telling." "What's wrong with them?" The security chief's shoulders sagged. "We don't know. They won't eat, won't calm down, won't let anyone near them. The council meets in the morning to decide what to do." Can I see them? Absolutely not. They're dangerous. Helen set down her chopsticks. I'm a xenobiologist. I've worked with aggressive species before. These aren't just aggressive. They're desperate. Then they need help, not a committee meeting. Horvath studied the small human. She barely reached his mid-torso, and her species was notoriously fragile. One swipe from a cub's claws could cause serious damage. The observation deck has cameras. You can watch from there, but you don't enter that bay. Fair enough. They walked together back toward the cargo section. Horvath pulled up the security feeds on the observation deck's main screen. The cubs were visible now, clustered in the corner. The smallest one was shaking. Helen leaned closer to the screen, her eyes narrowing. She watched in silence for several minutes, then pulled out a small portable scanner from her pocket. "What are you looking for?" Horvath asked. "I'm not sure yet." Helen adjusted settings on her device, pointing it at the screen. "Can you show me the bay's environmental readings?" Horvath pulled up another display. Temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, all within normal ranges for SYLTH physiology. Helen's scanner beeped. She frowned at the readout, then looked at the environmental data again. Her frown deepened. "What?" Horvath said. "Was the atmospheric recycler installed?" 2 weeks ago. New model, more efficient." "What?" Helen's eyes widened. She turned to Horvath, and he saw something in her expression that made his spine stiffen. Recognition. Understanding. Anger. "I need you to shut it down," Helen said. "What?" "No. That recycler cost 40,000 credits. It's killing them." "That's impossible. It's rated for all common species. SYLTH cubs aren't common. Their hearing range is 3 times broader than adults." Helen held up her scanner. "That recycler emits a high-frequency hum. Most species can't hear it, but those cubs can. It's like someone's driving spikes into their ears, constantly, for 3 days straight." Horvath stared at her. "That's why they're aggressive." "They're not aggressive. They're in agony. The manual override is in the bay itself." "Then I'm going in." "Absolutely not." Helen was already moving toward the door. "You can arrest me after, but I'm not letting them suffer another second." Horvath grabbed her shoulder, gently but firmly. "I'll do it. I'm Madamert." "You're not." But Helen shook her head. "They've seen you as a threat already. Send me." Before he could argue further, she slipped through his grip and punched the door controls. The cargo bay opened, and Helen walked inside. Helen's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped into the cargo bay. The door sealed behind her with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the darkness. Her eyes adjusted slowly, picking out shapes among the shadows. Crates, equipment, and 3 small figures pressed against a far wall. The cubs saw her immediately. Their scales flashed red, and the largest one took a step forward, claws scraping against the metal floor. The sound made Helen's skin crawl, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Easy," she whispered, though she knew they couldn't understand her words. "I'm here to help." The smallest cub whimpered, a sound so pitiful that Helen felt her throat tighten. Behind the observation window, she could see Horvath watching, his weapon ready. He'd burst in if things went wrong. She had maybe 30 seconds before that happened. The manual override panel was mounted on the wall to her left, about 10 meters from where she stood. 10 meters that put her directly in the cub's path. The recycler hummed above her head, a sound she could barely hear but knew was torture for the creatures watching her. Helen took 1 step sideways. The cubs tensed. Another step. The middle-sized cub snarled, showing teeth. "I know," Helen said softly. "I know it hurts. Just let me fix it." She moved slowly, keeping her body turned slightly away from them in what she hoped was a non-threatening posture. On Earth, she'd worked with frightened animals before. Dogs rescued from bad situations. Cats gone feral. The principles were the same. Move slow, speak soft, don't make direct eye contact. 0.5 meters from the panel. The largest cub moved to intercept her, scales bright crimson. Helen stopped. "Please," she said, "just a little further." The cub's ear slits were pressed flat against its skull, and Helen could see them trembling. Not from rage, from pain. The poor thing was suffering, and it thought she was just another threat. Helen did something she'd learned from her grandmother, who'd raised horses on a farm in Montana. She started humming. Low and steady, a tuneless sound that was more vibration than melody. Animals responded to tone more than words. The largest cub cocked its head, confused. The humming didn't hurt like other sounds. It was soft, soothing. Helen took another step, then another. The cubs watched but didn't charge. She reached the panel, and her fingers flew over the controls, searching for the recycler's power switch. The station's layout wasn't intuitive, and she'd only glanced at the schematics once there. She found it. A simple toggle switch marked with standard galactic symbols. "Here goes everything," Helen muttered and flipped the switch. The recycler's hum died instantly. The silence that followed felt thick and heavy. Helen held her breath, waiting. The change in the cubs was immediate and dramatic. Their scales shifted from red to a softer blue-green. The smallest one uncovered its ear slits, eyes wide. The largest lowered its claws and sat down heavily, as if its legs had suddenly given out. Alarms began blaring throughout the bay. Red lights flashed. The door burst open and Horvath charged in, weapon raised, followed by two more security officers. "Stand down," Helen shouted, stepping between the guards and the cubs. "They're not a threat." "You triggered a station alert," Horvath said, his weapon still pointed at the cubs. "Because I shut down the recycler." "Look at them." Horvath did look. The cubs weren't attacking. They weren't even moving. They were huddled together, the smallest one in the middle, all three breathing hard like they'd just run a marathon. Commander Yeltris's voice crackled over the communication system. "Security team, report. What's the situation in Cargo Bay 3? Horvath kept his weapon trained on the cubs, but his expression had changed. The humans shut down the atmospheric recycler. "The cubs have ceased aggressive behavior." "Why would she do that?" Helen stepped forward, speaking directly to the communication panel on Horvath's armor. "Commander, the recycler emits a high-frequency sound. It's inaudible to most species, but SWILTH cubs have enhanced hearing. They've been in constant pain for 3 days." There was a long pause. "Explain." Helen pulled out her scanner and held it up, even though Yeltris couldn't see it. "I measured the frequency at 47,000 hertz. According to the SWILTH biological database, adult SWILTH hear up to 35,000 hertz, but cubs hear up to 60,000. That recycler has been torturing them since it was installed." "That's impossible." "The recycler is rated safe for all station species. Rated for adults, not juveniles. Nobody checked, because SWILTH cubs are rare on stations. But the pain would be like someone screaming directly into your ears, constantly, every second, with no escape." Another pause. "I'm coming down. Nobody moves until I arrive." The communication cut off. Helen looked at the cubs, who were still huddled together, but watching her with what looked like cautious curiosity. The smallest one chirped softly, a questioning sound. "It's okay now," Helen said. "The bad noise is gone." Horvath lowered his weapon slowly. "I should arrest you for unauthorized access to station systems." "Probably, but I won't." "Not yet." The big Brelin moved closer to the cubs, studying them. "They really were in pain this whole time. Every second. We tried everything. Sedatives, dampeners, empathic projection. We never thought to check for environmental factors." Helen knelt down, making herself smaller. The middle-sized cub watched her intently. "On Earth, we have animals with different hearing ranges. Dogs hear things we can't. Bats use sonar. We're used to the idea that other species experience the world differently. And you thought to check because of this." "I thought to check because they kept covering their ears. It seemed obvious once I noticed." Commander Yeltris arrived 10 minutes later, accompanied by 3 other senior staff members. The Quilix commander stood at the observation window for a long time, watching the cubs. They had moved closer to Helen, though they still kept a safe distance. The smallest one kept chirping softly. "Turn the recycler back on," Yeltris said. Briefly. "Commander, that's cruel," Helen protested. "It's a test. If your theory is correct, their behavior will change immediately. If not, we need to know." Helen hated it, but she understood the logic. She reached for the panel and flipped the switch. The recycler hummed to life, The reaction was instantaneous. All three cubs screamed and scrambled away, scales flashing bright red again. The smallest one covered its ear slits with its forelimbs, and the largest turned toward Helen with claws extended. Off, Yeltris commanded. Helen shut it down again. Within seconds, the cubs calmed, though they eyed her warily now. You were correct, Dr. Wright, Yeltris said. Which means we've been torturing these cubs for 3 days because of our own oversight. The commander's voice was heavy with something that might have been shame. Switch to backup systems. That recycler stays offline until we find a solution. Helen felt relief wash over her, but it was followed quickly by concern. Commander, there's another problem. The cubs haven't eaten in 3 days. They're dehydrated and weak. Will they accept food now that the pain has stopped? I don't know, but I'd like to try. Yeltris studied her for a moment. Very well, but Horvath stays with you. One sign of aggression, and we remove you immediately. Helen nodded and moved slowly toward the food dispenser mounted on the wall. She selected protein pellets rated for SYLTH dietary needs and held out a handful, sitting down cross-legged on the floor. Come on, she said softly. You must be starving. The cubs watched her, waited. Then, slowly, the smallest one took a tentative step forward. The smallest cub moved forward with jerky, hesitant steps. Its scales flickered between blue and green, colors that Helen hoped meant curiosity rather than fear. The other 2 cubs watched from their corner, bodies tense and ready to flee. Helen kept her hand extended, palm up, the protein pellets resting on her skin. She'd learned patience working with traumatized animals back on Earth. You couldn't rush trust. It came in its own time, or not at all. The cub stopped just out of reach. This close, Helen could see details she'd missed before. The scales weren't just one color, but many, layered like tiny jewels. The eyes were golden with vertical pupils. The claws, which had seemed so dangerous, were no bigger than Helen's fingernails. This was a baby. A scared, hurt baby who'd been in agony for days. Take your time, Helen whispered. The cub stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the food. Its stomach made a gurgling sound that was audible even to Helen's ears. The poor thing was starving. Behind her, Horvath shifted his weight. The movement made the cub flinch back. Don't move, Helen said quietly. Let it come to us. They waited. Helen's arm began to ache from holding it still, but she didn't lower it. The cub crept forward again, even slower this time. Its small tongue flicked out, testing the air. Then, in a movement so fast Helen almost missed it, the cub snatched a pellet from her palm and darted back to its siblings. All 3 cubs examined the pellet. The smallest one ate it first, chewing carefully. The others watched. When nothing bad happened, when their sibling didn't collapse or cry out, the middle-sized cub approached Helen. This one was bolder. It walked right up to her hand and took 2 pellets, then sat down where it was and ate them both. The largest cub, the one that had been most aggressive, remained in the corner. But Helen saw its eyes fixed on the food in her palm. Your turn, Helen said to it. I know you're hungry too. The large cub's pride warred with its hunger. Finally, hunger won. It stalked forward, scales flashing through several colors, red to orange to yellow to green. It snatched the remaining pellets from Helen's hand and backed away quickly, but it didn't return to the corner. Instead, it sat between Helen and its siblings like a guard. Helen stood slowly and returned to the dispenser. She filled a bowl with water and another with more food pellets, then placed both on the floor and backed away. The cubs needed space to eat without feeling threatened. They fell on the food and water like they'd been starved for weeks, not days. The small one dunked its entire face in the water bowl and drank in loud gulps. The other 2 ate pellets by the mouthful, barely chewing. Commander Yeltris's voice came through Horvath's communicator. Dr. Wright, well done. Please exit the bay so we can observe their behavior without interference. Helen glanced at the cubs. They were focused on food, not on her. She nodded and walked toward the door, moving slowly to avoid startling them. As she passed through, the smallest cub looked up from the water bowl and chirped. Just once. A soft sound in the observation deck. Several crew members had gathered. Telvin, a Quilix engineer Helen had met briefly during her first week, was adjusting camera angles to get better views of the cubs. A Norvin medical officer named Surith was studying bioscanner readings with interest. Remarkable recovery speed, Surith said. Their stress hormones are dropping rapidly. Heart rates normalizing. Commander Yeltris stood with arms folded, watching the cubs eat. Dr. Wright, you may have saved 3 lives today. The council was leaning toward euthanasia. Several members argued the cubs were diseased or mentally damaged. They were just in pain, Helen said. Anyone would act aggressive under those circumstances. Not anyone, Horvath said. I've seen soldiers break under less. These cubs held together for 3 days. They had each other, Helen pointed out. The big one protected the others. That takes strength. Telvin looked up from his screens. There's a problem, though. The cubs are wards of the station now. SYLTH authorities claim their parent violated abandonment laws. They won't take responsibility. What does that mean? Helen asked. It means the cubs have no legal guardian. They need someone to care for them until they reach maturity, which for SYLTH is approximately 8 years. Commander Yeltris turned to face Helen. Most species on this station are incompatible as caretakers. Relum body temperature is too high for SYLTH young. Quilix communicate primarily through scent markers that SYLTH find disorienting. Norvans require atmospheric conditions that would harm SYLTH development. Helen felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. And humans are compatible. Similar temperature ranges, similar dietary flexibility, similar day-night cycle preferences. You want me to raise them? I want you to consider it. Temporarily, of course, until we can find a permanent solution. Helen looked through the window at the 3 cubs. They'd finished eating and were now exploring their environment cautiously, no longer hiding in the corner. The smallest one was trying to climb a crate, while the middle one investigated a stack of supply containers. The largest sat near the water bowl, watching everything. I'm a xenobiologist, not a parent, Helen said. You're someone who noticed what everyone else missed, Yeltris replied. You're someone who broke protocol to stop their suffering. You're someone they're already beginning to trust. As if to emphasize the point, the smallest cub looked toward the observation window and chirped again. Its siblings looked too, and all 3 stared at the spot where Helen stood. They can't see through the glass, Horvath said. They remember her voice, Surith said, checking his instruments. Their bio readings spike with interest when she speaks. They've imprinted on her as a non-threat, possibly as a source of relief from pain. Helen pressed her hand against the glass. 3 days ago, she'd been cataloging plant samples and planning research projects. Now she was being asked to become a guardian to 3 alien cubs who'd been abandoned by their own kind. What if I'm not good enough? Helen asked quietly. You're already better than the alternative, Yeltris said, which is institutionalization in a SYLTH facility designed for abandoned young. The survival rate is less than 40%. Helen closed her eyes. She thought about the smallest cub scream when the recycler was on. She thought about 3 days of agony that no one had stopped. She thought about the soft chirp of trust. I need supplies, Helen said, opening her eyes. Proper habitat setup, dietary supplements, medical monitoring equipment. And I need access to SYLTH cultural databases. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. Yeltris's expression, hard to read on a Quilix face, seemed to soften slightly. You'll have everything you need. Horvath will coordinate security clearances. Telvin can modify adjacent quarters for habitat space. Surith will handle medical oversight. And me? Helen asked. What do I do? You figure out how to be a parent to 3 beings who've forgotten what safety feels like. Helen returned to the cargo bay. The cubs noticed immediately. The smallest one scrambled down from its crate and moved toward her, stopping a few meters away. The other 2 watched from their positions, alert but not hostile. Helen sat down on the floor again, making herself small and unthreatening. So, she said to them, I guess we're family now. The smallest cub tilted its head, processing the tone of her voice, if not the words. Then it did something that surprised everyone watching. It walked right up to Helen and curled against her leg, scales shifting to a soft, peaceful blue. The other cubs exchanged glances, then joined their sibling. Within moments, Helen was surrounded by three small bodies, all trembling slightly, but no longer from fear. From the observation deck, Horvath spoke into his communicator. "Commander, I think we made the right choice." "Time will tell," Yeltris replied. "Time will tell." 3 weeks had passed since Helen became guardian to the cubs. Her quarters now connected to a converted storage room that Telvin had transformed into a proper habitat. Soft bedding materials lined one corner. Climbing structures made from station materials filled another. The walls were painted with calming colors that appealed to HFY vision. Helen had named them, though she knew it was probably too human a thing to do. The smallest was Pip, because of the high-pitched chirping sounds. The middle one became Ridge, for the distinctive pattern of scales along its spine. The largest, protective and cautious, was Frost, for scales that could shift to an almost white shade when calm. Pip was the first to wake each morning, chirping loudly until Helen stumbled from her bed to prepare their breakfast. Ridge was the curious one, investigating every corner of the habitat and regularly trying to dismantle station equipment to see how it worked. Frost remained the guardian, always positioning itself between potential threats and its siblings. Helen learned their individual chirp patterns. A quick trill meant hunger. A low warble meant they were tired. A sharp bark meant danger or fear. She responded with consistent words paired with their sounds, hoping they'd eventually associate meaning with her language. "Food," she'd say when they trilled, presenting their breakfast. "Sleep," she'd murmur when they warbled, dimming the lights. "Safe," she'd repeat when they barked, showing them there was no threat. The cubs began responding to her words even without their own chirps prompting them. When Helen said food, all three would gather near the feeding area. "Sleep" sent them to their bedding corner. "Safe" made them relax, scales shifting to calm colors. Other crew members visited regularly. Horvath brought specialized dietary supplements he'd researched in the SYLTH medical databases. Telvin created toys based on traditional SYLTH cub entertainment. Puzzle boxes that rewarded problem-solving with treats, climbing posts that adjusted difficulty, sensory balls that changed texture and temperature. Surith conducted medical checks twice weekly, always impressed by the cubs' development. "Their growth rate is normal now," the Norvan doctor told Helen during one visit. "The trauma of those 3 days may have psychological effects, but physically, they're thriving." Helen sat on the habitat floor, watching Ridge attempt to solve one of Telvin's puzzle boxes while Pip tried to help and Frost supervised. "They still flinch at certain sounds," she said. "Anything high-pitched makes them nervous. That may fade with time, or it may not. Trauma leaves marks. I'm doing my best. Your best is better than most. I've seen biological parents do worse with their own species young." The praise should have made Helen feel better, but doubt gnawed at her. She read every file on SYLTH culture she could access. She learned about their social structures, their educational practices, their coming-of-age rituals. The more she learned, the more she wondered if a human could really provide what these cubs needed. Late one night, Helen sat in her quarters reviewing files when her communicator chimed. Commander Yeltris wanted to see her immediately. The tone suggested it wasn't good news that I in the commander's office. Yeltris stood beside a holographic display showing an official-looking SYLTH in formal robes. The SYLTH's scales were an impressive silver gray that spoke of age and authority. "Dr. Wright, this is Ambassador Tilrak from the SYLTH Diplomatic Corps," Yeltris said. "The ambassador has concerns about the cubs in your care." Tilrak's voice was cool and precise. "Dr. Wright, I've reviewed your credentials and your current guardianship arrangement. While I acknowledge your initial intervention was helpful, I have serious concerns about a human raising SYLTH young." Helen kept her voice steady. "The cubs are healthy and developing normally. Medical scans confirm this. Physical health is not my only concern. Cultural education, proper socialization with their own kind, preparation for integration into SYLTH society. These are things you cannot provide. I'm learning your culture. I study every day. Reading about SYLTH culture is not the same as living it, Dr. Wright. The cubs need to learn our ways from someone who understands them instinctively. With respect, Ambassador, their parent understood SYLTH culture instinctively, and she still abandoned them. Tilrak's scales flashed orange, a sign of anger. You know nothing of that situation. I know 3 cubs were left alone and in pain. I know nobody from your government has offered to help them, which is why I'm here now. I'm arranging transfer to a SYLTH institution that specializes in abandoned young. The cubs will be with their own kind, learning proper behaviors and customs. Helen's heart sank. I've read about those institutions. The success rate is terrible. The success rate is realistic. Not all cubs can be saved, Dr. Wright. Some are too damaged by their experiences. These cubs aren't damaged. They're resilient. They survived 3 days of torture and still have the capacity to trust. Trust is not enough. They need to be SYLTH, not human pets. The word stung, but Helen forced herself not to react emotionally. When would this transfer happen? I'll arrive at the station in 4 days to conduct a formal evaluation. If I determine the cubs are not receiving adequate SYLTH cultural education, I have authority to remove them immediately. The hologram flickered off. Helen stood in silence for a moment, processing the threat. For days. Is there anything we can do? She asked Yeltris. Legally, Tilrak has jurisdiction over SYLTH minors. If the ambassador declares your guardianship inadequate, I cannot refuse the transfer. So I have 4 days to prove I can raise them properly, according to SYLTH standards, which Tilrak will define. Dr. Wright, I want you to succeed. These cubs have flourished under your care. But I won't lie to you. This will be difficult. Helen returned to her quarters and entered the habitat quietly. The cubs were asleep in their bedding corner, tangled together in a pile of limbs and tails. Pip's head rested on Ridge's back. Frost curled protectively around both siblings. They looked peaceful, safe, happy. Helen sat down against the wall and opened her datapad. For days to learn enough about SYLTH culture to satisfy an ambassador who clearly didn't want to be satisfied. 4 days to prove she could give these cubs what they needed. She started reading about traditional SYLTH parenting practices. The files described bonding rituals, educational games, communication techniques. Some of it she'd already been doing instinctively. Other parts were completely foreign. There was a section on rhythmic patterns used to soothe distressed cubs. Helen read the description and tried to replicate the hand movements. Clap twice, pause, clap once, pause, clap 3 times. It was supposed to create a calming effect. Pip stirred in sleep and chirped softly. Helen continued the pattern, keeping it quiet. The cub scales shifted to a deeper blue, the color of contentment. Helen worked through the night, reading and practicing. She learned about feeding rituals that taught patience and sharing. She studied sleeping arrangements that mimicked traditional SYLTH family structures. She memorized greetings, warnings, and comfort sounds that SYLTH parents used with their young as dawn approached. Helen had filled 3 notepads with information. She'd recorded herself practicing SYLTH parenting techniques so she could review and improve. She'd created a schedule incorporating traditional practices into their daily routine. The cubs woke with their usual morning energy. Pip chirped for breakfast. Ridge immediately began investigating a new corner of the habitat, and Frost stretched luxuriously before taking up its guardian position. Okay, everyone, Helen said. We're going to try something new today. She began the hand-clapping pattern she'd learned. The cubs stopped what they were doing and watched, fascinated. The pattern was hypnotic, rhythmic. After a few repetitions, Pip tried to mimic the movements with its small claws. Helen smiled. That's it. You're learning. Ridge joined in, getting the pattern wrong but trying enthusiastically. Even Frost watched with interest, though it didn't participate. This was just the beginning. Helen had 4 days to integrate SYLTH cultural practices into their daily life. 4 days to show Ambassador Tilrak that a human could honor SYLTH traditions while providing the love and safety these cubs desperately needed. 4 days to keep her family together. Ambassador Tilrak arrived precisely on schedule. The SYLTH diplomat was taller than Helen had expected, easily 2 meters, with scales that shimmered like polished silver. Those scales shifted colors subtly as Tilrak moved, displaying emotions in ways Helen was still learning to read. Helen met the ambassador in the habitat's observation area, with Commander Yeltris present as witness. Through the transparent wall, the cubs could be seen playing with one of Telvin's puzzle boxes. They'd become quite good at solving them over the past weeks. Ambassador Tilrak, welcome to Station Gamma 7, Yeltris said formally. Tilrak barely acknowledged the greeting, eyes fixed on the cubs. They appear physically healthy. They are, Helen confirmed. Medical scans show normal development across all metrics. Physical health is merely one aspect. I'm here to assess their cultural development. Tilrak's scales flickered orange briefly. The environment is too warm. It's within the acceptable range for SYLTH young, Helen said, keeping her voice calm. Acceptable is not optimal. SYLTH cubs thrive at precisely 19 degrees. This feels like 21, 20.5, Helen corrected. Ridge tends to get cold at 19, so we compromised. You compromised. Based on one cub's preferences, you've altered optimal conditions for all three. Tilrak made a note on a datapad. This is concerning. It suggests you're anthropomorphizing them, treating them like human children who require individual accommodation. Helen bit back a sharp response. I'm responding to their individual needs. Ridge has slightly different metabolism than its siblings. The medical scans confirm this. May I see the cubs directly? Of course. They entered the habitat together. The cubs noticed immediately. Pip chirped a greeting to Helen, then stopped as it saw Tilrak. The cub scales shifted from blue to yellow, uncertainty. Ridge moved behind Frost, who took up a protective stance. They fear me, Tilrak observed. Their own kind. They don't know you, Helen said. They're cautious around strangers. Healthy SYLTH cubs should recognize adult SYLTH as potential caregivers. This fear suggests improper socialization. Helen knelt down and performed the rhythmic hand-clapping pattern she'd learned. The cubs relaxed slightly, recognizing the traditional calming gesture. Pip approached first, then Ridge. Frost remained wary but stopped displaying defensive posture. Tilrak's scales flickered through several colors rapidly. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. You know the old patterns, the ambassador said quietly. I've been studying. I want to honor their heritage. Knowing patterns and understanding their meaning are different things. Why did you choose that particular sequence? It's a traditional greeting comfort pattern, used by SYLTH parents to calm anxious young while establishing authority without threat. And you learned this from a database. Yes. Is that wrong? Tilrak didn't answer, instead moving closer to the cubs. The ambassador made a soft sound, something between a hum and a chirp. It was clearly a SYLTH vocalization, and the cubs responded with interest. Ridge chirped back, attempting to mimic the sound. They understand some SYLTH vocal communication, Tilrak noted, making another note on the datapad. They're learning. I play recordings of SYLTH speech patterns during their rest periods. It's recommended in the Cultural Development Protocols. You've read the Cultural Development Protocols? All of them. Multiple times. Tilrak studied her for a long moment. The ambassador's scales had settled into a neutral gray-blue that Helen couldn't quite interpret. Show me their feeding routine. Helen prepared the cubs' midday meal, incorporating the ritual she'd learned from SYLTH parenting guides. She arranged the food in 3 portions, specific patterns that encourage patience and sharing. The cubs had to wait until all portions were ready before any could eat. It taught impulse control and consideration for siblings. Pip waited, though it clearly wanted to start immediately. Ridge watched Helen's hands, anticipating the signal. Frost maintained its guardian position, but kept one eye on the food. When Helen gave the traditional start signal, a specific double chirp, all 3 cubs ate in turns, never rushing, always leaving some for their siblings. It was orderly, civilized, unmistakably SYLTH in its structure. They've learned this well, Tilrak admitted. How long did the training take? 4 days of intensive practice, building on behavioral patterns we'd already established. For days, Tilrak's scales flashed orange again, stronger this time. That's impossible. SYLTH parents spend weeks teaching proper feeding protocol. I used positive reinforcement techniques common in earth animal training, combined with SYLTH traditional methods. The cubs are intelligent and eager to learn, or they're performing to please you, without understanding the deeper cultural significance. Helen felt frustration building. With respect, Ambassador, what exactly would satisfy you? They're healthy, learning traditional practices, and developing normally. What more do you need to see? I need to see if they recognize SYLTH authority over human preferences. I need to know if they understand they are SYLTH, not human pets. They're cubs. They don't think about species identity. They think about safety, food, play, and comfort, which is precisely why cultural education is critical now, while their identities are forming. Tilrak moved toward Pip, the smallest and most trusting cub. The ambassador extended a hand, scales shifting to warm colors. Pip looked at Helen, then at Tilrak. The cub took a tentative step toward the ambassador, drawn by some instinctive recognition of its own kind that Helen's heart clenched. She wanted Pip to trust Tilrak. She wanted the cubs to connect with SYLTH culture. But she also feared what that connection might cost. Tilrak made a soft, crooning sound. Pip moved closer, fascinated. The ambassador's scales began a slow color shift, cycling through patterns that clearly meant something significant to the cub. Then Tilrak's scales flashed bright red, a sudden aggressive display. It was a test, Helen realized too late. Testing whether the cubs understood SYLTH threat displays. Pip should have retreated, submitted, shown appropriate respect for adult dominance. Instead, Pip turned and ran to Helen, scales flashing with fear, chirping frantically. Ridge and Frost immediately flanked their sibling, all three clustering around Helen in a defensive formation with her at the center. They'd chosen her over their own kind. Tilrak's scales went completely gray, unreadable. I see. You scared them deliberately, Helen said, anger finally breaking through her careful diplomacy. I tested their understanding of SYLTH social hierarchy. They failed. They recognized a threat and sought safety with their guardian. That's not failure, that's intelligence. Their guardian should be SYLTH. Instead, they see you as their protector, their parent, their primary attachment figure. Tilrak's voice was cold. This is exactly what I feared. You've bonded them to you so completely that they don't recognize their own people. I've kept them alive and given them stability. Their own people abandoned them. One SYLTH abandoned them. That doesn't justify stealing them from their entire culture. I'm not stealing anything. I'm teaching them their heritage while providing the safety they need. Tilrak stood. I need time to consider my evaluation. I'll return tomorrow with my decision. The ambassador left without another word. Helen sat on the floor, and the three cubs immediately climbed into her lap, still frightened from Tilrak's display. It's okay, Helen whispered, stroking their scales gently. You're safe. But she wondered if that was true. If Tilrak decided to take them, Helen had no legal standing to refuse. The cubs would go to an institution where abandoned young rarely thrived, where they'd be treated as damaged rather than resilient. Helen held them close and tried not to think about tomorrow. Helen didn't sleep that night. She sat in the habitat watching the cubs rest, memorizing every detail. The way Pip's scales dimmed to almost black during deep sleep. The soft snoring sound Ridge made. The way Frost twitched in dreams, reliving some unknown adventure. If Tilrak took them tomorrow, these might be her last hours with them. Someone knocked softly on the outer door. Helen checked the security screen and saw Ambassador Tilrak standing alone in the corridor. No entourage, no official recording equipment, just the SYLTH diplomat, scales shifting through colors that suggested uncertainty. Helen opened the door. Ambassador, I wasn't expecting you until morning. May I come in? They sat in Helen's quarters, the habitat visible through the connecting doorway. The cubs were still asleep, tangled together in their usual pile. I was unable to sleep, Tilrak said. I kept thinking about today's evaluation. And you asked me what would satisfy me. It was a fair question, and I didn't have a good answer. Tilrak's scales settled into a deep blue. The truth is, I'm not sure anything would satisfy me. Because I'm not evaluating the cubs. I'm evaluating my own failures. Helen waited, sensing the ambassador needed to speak. I had a sibling, Tilrak continued, younger than me by 3 years. When I was 12, our parent abandoned her, just left her at a transport station and never came back. I was too young to be a legal guardian, so my sibling went to an institution. What happened to her? She lasted 6 months before she stopped eating. The grief counselors said she couldn't bond with anyone after the abandonment trauma. She simply gave up. Tilrak's scales flickered between colors, pain made visible. I became a diplomat to change policies around abandoned cubs, to create better systems, better institutions. But the truth is, the institutions are terrible. They've always been terrible. And I've spent 30 years trying to fix something that can't be fixed. I'm sorry about your sibling, Helen said quietly. When I saw those cubs choose you over me, over their own kind, I was angry. But not at you, at myself, because they were right to choose you. You've given them what my sibling never had. Well, I couldn't give her. Safety, trust, love. They need their culture too. Their heritage, yes. But culture without love is just performance. And love without culture is just sentiment. They need both. Tilrak looked directly at Helen. I don't think you can provide both, Dr. Wright. But I also don't think anyone else can do better. Which leaves me with an impossible decision. Helen leaned forward. What if it's not impossible? What if there's a way to give them both? I'm listening. You're a diplomat. You visit stations regularly. What if you became a cultural advisor to the cubs? Regular visits, teaching them SYLTH traditions, giving them connection to their people. Meanwhile, I continue as primary guardian, providing daily care and stability. Shared custody between species. That's unprecedented. So is a human raising SYLTH cubs. We're already breaking new ground. Tilrak was quiet for a long time, scales cycling through thoughtful colors. The institutions won't like this. It undermines their purpose. Their purpose should be helping cubs, not warehousing them. You're remarkably direct for someone asking for diplomatic favor. I'm fighting for my family. Direct is all I have left. Tilrak's scales brightened to something almost like amber, warm and approving. Your family. You really see them that way, don't you? I see them as cubs who deserve better than they've received. Whether that makes them family is a more complicated question. A soft chirp came from the habitat. Pip was awake, scales displaying the curious yellow-green of early morning alertness. The cub saw Tilrak and froze. May I try something? Tilrak asked. Of course. They entered the habitat together. Pip backed toward Helen instinctively, but Helen gently encouraged the cub forward. It's okay. Ambassador Tilrak isn't here to hurt you. Tilrak sat on the floor, making the SYLTH equivalent of a non-threatening posture. The ambassador began a soft vocalization, something Helen had never heard before. It was layered, harmonious, almost like music. Pip's scales shifted to softer colors. Ridge and Frost woke, drawn by the sound. All three cubs approached cautiously, fascinated by the vocalization. It's a traditional lullaby, Tilrak explained between phrases. Very old. My own parents sang it to me. The cubs sat in a semicircle, listening. Their scales synchronized colors, shifting in response to the song's emotional tones. It was clearly speaking to something deep in their genetic memory, touching cultural roots Helen could never access. When the song ended, Pip moved closer to Tilrak and made a soft sound, attempting to mimic part of the melody. Tilrak's scales flashed bright gold, pure joy. You want to learn? The cubs chirped in unison, an enthusiastic yes in any language. For the next hour, Helen watched as Tilrak taught the cubs their first true SYLTH lesson. Not from a database or recording, but from a living connection to their culture. The ambassador was patient, encouraging everything the cubs needed from their own kind. And when they grew tired, when Pip started to fuss from exhaustion, they came to Helen for comfort. She held them while Tilrak watched, and something shifted in the ambassador's expression. "This could work," Tilrak said, "if we're both committed to their welfare above our own preferences." "I'm committed," Helen said firmly. "As am I. I'll need to convince my government, which won't be easy. Bureaucrats don't like precedent-breaking arrangements. Tell them it's a pilot program. Experimental approach to abandoned cub rehabilitation. You think like a diplomat. I think like someone who refuses to give up." Tilrak stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Dr. Wright, may I ask you something? Anything. When you first found the cubs, when you realized the recycler was causing their pain, why did you act immediately? You could have reported the theory and let others test it. You could have protected your career by following proper procedure." Helen looked at the 3 cubs, now drowsy and content in her arms. "Because they were suffering, and I could stop it. That's all that mattered. That's what my sibling needed. Someone who cared more about her suffering than about procedure. Someone who acted instead of deliberating." Tilrak's scales settled into a peaceful blue. "The cubs are fortunate to have you. I'm fortunate to have this chance to honor my sibling's memory by ensuring these 3 don't face the same fate." After Tilrak left, Helen carried the cubs to their sleeping area. They were already dozing, scales displaying the deep colors of contentment. "You're staying," she whispered to them. "We're staying together." Pip chirped softly in sleep, a sound of perfect trust. 6 months later, the arrangement was official. Helen remained primary guardian, while Ambassador Tilrak visited monthly for cultural education. The cubs thrived. They learned SYLTH traditions and human stories. They solved puzzles in both SYLTH and human styles. They became fluent in multiple languages, speaking Common Galactic with Helen and developing SYLTH with Tilrak. Commander Yeltris filed reports on the program's success. Other stations expressed interest. 3 more abandoned cubs were placed in similar arrangements, their lives saved by a new approach that valued both love and culture. And on Station Gamma 7, 3 cubs learned the most important lesson of all. Family wasn't about species or biology. It was about who stayed when things got hard, who noticed your pain and stopped it, who taught you your heritage while building your future. Helen watched them play, Frost protecting its siblings while Ridge investigated everything and Pip chirped questions constantly. They were growing so fast. Soon they'd be juveniles, then adolescents, eventually adults. But no matter how big they grew, no matter how much they learned about being SYLTH, they'd always remember the human who heard their pain when no one else could. And Helen would always remember the 3 cubs who taught her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is care without permission, act without approval, and love without limits. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not advanced technology or superior strength, but the stubborn refusal to look away from suffering. The willingness to break rules when rules caused harm. The courage to build family from fragments and call it home. The cubs chirped together, a sound of pure happiness. Helen smiled and joined them on the floor, ready for whatever came next. Together,